The autumn wind carried dust and dried sage across the vast Wyoming territory, whistling through the weathered boards of Silas McGraw's ranch house like a mournful song that had played for too many years. The giant of a man stood at his porch, all 6 feet and 7 inches of him casting a shadow that stretched across the barren yard like a dark finger pointing toward nothing in particular. His massive hands, scarred from countless days of breaking horses and mending fences, gripped a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Silas had built this place with those very hands 10 years prior, after the war had ended and left him with nowhere else to go. The house stood sturdy but empty, much like the man himself, functional, reliable, but devoid of the warmth that transforms a structure into a home. The locals in Dry Creek, the nearest town some 15 miles east, called him Big Cy when they spoke of him at all, which wasn't often. He preferred it that way. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. His cattle, some 200 head, grazed peacefully in the distance, their occasional lowing the only conversation he'd had in weeks. The ranch ran like clockwork under his careful management. But success in cattle didn't fill the echoing silence that greeted him each evening when he returned to his empty kitchen, where he'd heat up beans from a can and eat them standing over the sink, too tired to bother with the formality of sitting at the large oak table he'd crafted for a family that never materialized. Meanwhile, 30 miles south on the dusty road from Cheyenne, Martha Ellis adjusted her black morning dress for the 100th time as the stagecoach bounced violently over another rut. Her gloved hands clutched a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world: 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a handful of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and $17 that needed to last until she found work. 6 months had passed since pneumonia took James, her husband of 3 years, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and a reputation she couldn't repair in a town where being a young widow meant being either pitied or propositioned, with little ground between. The bank had taken their small homestead within 2 months. The general store where she'd worked wouldn't keep her on, claiming business was slow, but really meaning that Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, didn't appreciate how the male customers lingered when Martha was behind the counter. Martha had heard about opportunities in the territories, places where the past mattered less than the willingness to work hard. At 26, she still had strength in her arms and determination in her heart, even if that heart felt like it had been scraped hollow and left to dry in the prairie wind. Her auburn hair, once her pride, was now kept severely pinned beneath a simple bonnet. Beauty, she had learned, was a burden for a woman alone. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in Dry Creek just as the noon sun reached its peak. Martha stepped down, her legs unsteady after hours of violent jostling, and surveyed the town that would either save her or break what little remained of her spirit. Dry Creek was exactly what its name suggested, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that seemed to be in a perpetual argument with the wind about which direction the dust should blow. The Imperial Hotel, despite its grand name, was a 2-story establishment that leaned slightly to the left, as if it had grown tired of standing straight after too many years. Martha paid for one night, $3 that hurt to surrender, and asked the desk clerk, a thin man with nervous eyes, about employment opportunities. "Well, ma'am," he said, his Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing cork, "there's always need for help at the saloon, if you're that type." He stopped, seeing her morning dress and the flash of indignation in her green eyes. "Begging your pardon, the boarding house might need kitchen help, and there's been talk that Big Cy McGraw out at the Double M Ranch has been looking for someone to cook and keep house." "Big Cy?" Martha asked, trying to keep desperation from coloring her voice. "Silas McGraw. Owns one of the largest spreads in the territory. Good man. Pays fair, but—" The clerk paused, seeming to weigh his words. "He's particular and peculiar, keeps to himself mostly. Built like a mountain and about as talkative as one, too. Posted a notice 2 weeks back, but no one's taken the job yet." Martha found the notice pinned to the board outside the general store. The handwriting was careful but unpracticed. Need cook and housekeeper, room, board, and fair wages. Apply at Double M Ranch, 15 miles west on Canyon Road. S. McGraw. She spent her last $14 on supplies and hired a ride with a farmer heading that direction the next morning. The man, introducing himself as Henrik Olsen, spoke in heavily accented English about the drought, the price of grain, and finally, inevitably, about Silas McGraw. Good man, but lonely like the winter wolf. Lost his brother in the war. Came here with nothing but hurt. Built that ranch from dust and determination. Some say he's waiting for something, but nobody knows what. The Double M Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage made solid. A substantial house with a peaked roof, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fences that ran straight and true as far as the eye could see. Everything spoke of competence and care, but also of an almost aggressive orderliness, as if chaos was being held at bay through sheer will. Martha thanked Henrik and walked the quarter-mile drive to the house, her satchel growing heavier with each step. The front door was massive, built for a man who wouldn't want to duck his head entering his own home. She knocked, the sound seeming to echo across the empty prairie. The door opened, and Martha had to tilt her head back to look into the face of Silas McGraw. The word giant hadn't been an exaggeration. He filled the doorframe completely, his presence like a wall of solid muscle and weathered denim. His face, broader than any she'd seen, was carved with lines that spoke of sun and wind and sorrows carried alone. Dark hair, longer than fashion dictated, framed features that might have been handsome if they hadn't been set in such stern immobility. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray like winter storm clouds, holding a wariness that matched her own. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two damaged souls recognizing something familiar in the other's carefully guarded expression. "Mr. McGraw," Martha finally said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I've come about the position." Silas studied her for another moment, taking in the morning dress, the determined set of her shoulders, the way she met his gaze directly despite having to crane her neck. Most people, especially women, found his size intimidating. This one stood her ground like she'd grown roots right there on his porch. "You've done this work before." His voice was deep as distant thunder, rusty from disuse. "Yes, sir. I've kept house since I was 12, and there's nothing I can't cook if given proper supplies. It's isolated here. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles. Town's 15. "Isolation doesn't trouble me, Mr. McGraw." He stepped aside, the movement surprisingly graceful for such a large man. "Come in, then. We'll discuss terms." The interior of the house confirmed what Martha had suspected from outside. Everything was well made and functional, but cold as a tomb. No pictures on the walls, no cushions on the chairs, no tablecloth on the enormous dining table. It was shelter, not a home. The kitchen, though clean, looked barely used, with only a coffee pot and a cast-iron skillet showing signs of regular service. They sat at the kitchen table, Silas's massive frame making the sturdy furniture seem child-sized. He laid out the terms, simply room and board, $20 monthly wages, Sundays off if she wanted them. The work was cooking 3 meals, keeping the house, washing clothes, nothing she hadn't done before. "I'll need provisions from town weekly," Martha said, her practical nature asserting itself. "The kitchen needs proper supplies if you want proper meals." Something that might have been surprise flickered across his features. "Make a list. I go to town Saturdays. When would you need me to start?" "Today. If you're willing, supper would be..." He paused, as if trying to remember the last real meal he'd eaten at his own table. "Appreciated." Martha stood, removing her bonnet and gloves with decisive movements. "Then I'll need to see what provisions you have and make that list. Supper will be at 6, Mr. McGraw." As she moved toward the pantry, Silas remained seated, watching this small woman begin to disturb the careful emptiness he'd cultivated for so long. When she'd stood at his door, something in her eyes, a determination born from loss, a strength forged in sorrow, had spoken to the hollow places in his chest. He'd meant to conduct a proper interview, to be cautious and deliberate as he was in all things. Instead, he'd hired her within minutes. Now, listening to her move through his kitchen with purpose and efficiency, humming something soft and almost inaudible, Silas McGraw wondered if he'd just made the best or worst decision of his solitary life. The autumn wind still whistled through the boards, but somehow, with another human presence in his home, it sounded less like mourning and more like the world trying to find its way in. The first supper Martha cooked at the Double M Ranch consisted of beef stew with vegetables she'd coaxed from the nearly bare pantry, fresh biscuits that filled the kitchen with warmth, and an apple pie made from the dried fruit she'd found forgotten in a corner cupboard. Silas had entered the kitchen at exactly 6 o'clock, then stopped in the doorway as if he'd walked into the wrong house. The table was set with 2 plates, actual napkins she'd discovered in a drawer, and the oil lamp positioned to cast a golden glow across the simple meal. Steam rose from the stew pot, carrying scents that made the giant man's stomach remind him forcefully that beans and hardtack were poor substitutes for real food. "Sit, Mr. McGraw," Martha said without looking up from ladling stew into bowls. "Food's best when it's hot." He sat, the chair creaking under his weight, and watched her move with practiced efficiency. When she placed the bowl before him, he stared at it for a long moment, then picked up his spoon with the reverence usually reserved for church communion. The first bite made him close his eyes. "Is it satisfactory?" Martha asked, settling across from him with her own bowl. "It's—" Silas paused, searching for words he hadn't used in years. "It's been a long time since anyone cooked for me, Mrs. Ellis." They ate in silence, but it wasn't the oppressive quiet Silas had grown accustomed to. This was different, companionable. Somehow, the soft clink of spoons against bowls, the whisper of napkin against lips, the gentle rhythm of another person existing in his space. After supper, they sat at the kitchen table with papers and pen between them, drawing up what Martha insisted on calling terms of employment. She had a schoolteacher's handwriting, precise and flowing, making his own scratching seem crude by comparison. "I'll need my Sundays after morning breakfast," she said, pen poised, "for church and personal time." "Don't hold with church myself," Silas said carefully, "but you're free to go as you please. And I'll need a lock for my door." His massive head came up sharply, gray eyes narrowing. For a moment, Martha thought she'd offended him, but then understanding dawned across his weathered features. "I'll install one tomorrow," he said quietly. "You're safe here. Mrs. Ellis, I give you my word on that." "I believe you, Mr. McGraw, but a woman alone learns to take precautions." He nodded slowly. "Anything else?" "Yes." Martha met his gaze directly. "We should be clear about the nature of this arrangement. I'm your housekeeper and cook, nothing more." The tips of Silas's ears reddened slightly. "Ma'am, I would never— that is, I'm not looking for—" He stopped, took a breath, and started again. "You're employed here for honest work, honestly paid, nothing else expected or offered." Martha studied his face for a moment, then nodded and returned to her list. "I'll need fabric for curtains. This house needs softening." "Curtains," he said the word like it was foreign. "Yes, and perhaps a rug or two. If the budget allows, a house should feel welcoming, Mr. McGraw, even if it's just welcoming you home." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he wore. "Make your list, get what you need." They signed the agreement, both copies, with the solemnity of a treaty between nations. Martha retreated to her room, a small but clean space off the kitchen that had probably been meant for exactly this purpose. Silas had already brought her satchel in, placing it carefully on the narrow bed. That night, for the first time in months, Silas didn't stand over the sink with cold beans. He sat at his table, in his chair, and ate leftover stew that Martha had kept warm on the stove. The house felt different already, still quiet, but alive somehow, like a heart beginning to beat after a long pause. Over the next days, they developed a rhythm. Martha rose before dawn to start breakfast, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, the way Silas liked it, eggs and bacon, biscuits or flapjacks. He would enter the kitchen at precisely 5:30, nod his greeting, and eat while she packed his lunch for the day's work. Their conversations were minimal but necessary. Discussions of supplies needed, repairs required, preferences noted. "You don't care for carrots," Martha observed on the fourth morning, watching him carefully eat around them in his hash. "Never have," he admitted, seeming surprised she'd noticed. "I'll remember that." Small acknowledges like these began to accumulate. Silas learned that Martha hummed when she was content, went silent when worried. Martha discovered that Silas always removed his boots at the door without being asked, that he read for an hour each evening from books he ordered from Denver, that he had a sweet tooth he tried to hide but couldn't when she made cinnamon rolls. The first Saturday, Silas prepared to go to town for supplies. Martha handed him a list that made him raise an eyebrow. "Fabric, for the curtains we discussed, and flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork." She continued rattling off items while tying her bonnet. "I'm coming with you." "You are?" "How else will I know what's available? Besides, I need to select the fabric myself, and I should introduce myself to the shopkeepers if I'm to be ordering supplies." Silas wanted to argue but couldn't find logical grounds. The wagon ride to town was quiet. Martha perched beside him on the bench seat, maintaining a proper distance. She was aware of his size more than ever. Sitting next to him like this, his hands made the reins look like thread, his presence beside her solid as a mountain. In town, their arrival together caused a stir. Silas McGraw, who'd barely said 10 words to anyone in 10 years, helping a woman down from his wagon, a woman in morning dress, but young and pretty despite her severe appearance. At Henderson's general store. "Mrs." Henderson's eyes went wide as saucers. "Why, Mr. McGraw, and who might this be?" "Mrs. Ellis," Martha said before Silas could answer. "I'm Mr. McGraw's housekeeper. I'll be handling his household orders from now on." The way she said it, matter of fact, professional, with just enough steel to discourage speculation, impressed Silas. He watched her move through the store, selecting items with careful consideration of quality and price, charming Henderson with her knowledge while keeping Mrs. Henderson at arm's length with perfect propriety. At the fabric counter, she ran her fingers over bolts of cloth, finally selecting a simple yellow calico. "For the kitchen," she explained to Silas, "cheerful but practical." "Get enough for the parlor, too," he said gruffly. "That's a considerable expense." "Get it." She studied him for a moment, then nodded and turned back to the clerk. "I'll need 12 yards then." The ride home was different. Martha had relaxed slightly, pleased with her purchases. She told him about the price of coffee in Philadelphia, where she'd lived briefly as a child, compared to the frontier prices. He found himself telling her about his first winter here, when snow had trapped him in the house for 3 weeks with nothing but dried beef and determination. "Must have been frightening," she said. "Peaceful," he corrected, "but lonely." The word hung between them, an admission neither acknowledged directly. That evening, after supper, Martha spread the fabric on the kitchen table and began measuring. Silas sat in his usual chair, pretending to read but watching her work. Her fingers were quick and sure, marking measurements with chalk, humming that soft tune he was beginning to recognize. "What is that you're humming?" he asked suddenly. Martha looked up, startled. "Oh, I didn't realize. It's Shenandoah. My mother used to sing it." "It's nice," he said, then immediately returned to his book, ears reddening. Martha smiled slightly and continued working, humming a little louder now that she knew it didn't bother him. By the end of the second week, the kitchen had curtains that caught the morning sun and turned it golden. The parlor ones followed, transforming the stark room into something almost welcoming. Silas stood in the doorway, staring at the change. "It looks," he struggled for the word, "like a home," Martha suggested gently. "Yeah," he said roughly, "like a home." That night, he helped her wash dishes, despite her protests that it wasn't proper. They worked side by side, her washing, him drying with careful attention to each plate. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For giving me this position, for being—" She paused, searching for words. "Honorable." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for taking it, for making this place—" He gestured vaguely at the curtained windows, the clean dishes, the warmth that seemed to have crept into every corner. "Bearable." It was the most he'd said to her at once. Martha felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight grip she'd kept on herself since James died. Not healing, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, two lonely souls learning the careful dance of coexistence, neither ready to acknowledge that they were already beginning to look forward to morning coffee together, to evening meals shared, to the simple comfort of another heartbeat in the vast emptiness of the prairie night. The third week of Martha's employment began with an unexpected sound laughter, not the polite, controlled chuckle of social obligation, but genuine, surprised laughter that escaped from Silas McGraw's throat when he found Martha standing on a chair, wielding a broom at a particularly bold rooster that had somehow found its way into the kitchen. "Don't just stand there like a statue," Martha exclaimed, her usual composure cracking as the rooster flapped onto the table, scattering her carefully arranged breakfast preparations. "Help me catch this demon bird?" Silas moved with surprising agility for such a large man, corralling the rooster while Martha herded it toward him with her broom. They danced around the kitchen in an absurd ballet until Silas finally caught the bird, holding it at arm's length as it squawked indignantly. "How did it even get in?" he asked, still fighting back laughter. "Through the door you left open when you went to the well," Martha said, trying to look stern, but failing as a smile tugged at her lips. "Which you do every morning, despite having a perfectly good pump right here in the kitchen." "Force of habit," he admitted, carrying the rooster outside. "Been going to that well since before I installed the pump." When he returned, Martha had already restored order to the breakfast table. But something had changed. The air felt lighter, the awkward formality that had marked their first weeks together cracking like ice in spring. "Your eggs are probably cold now," Martha said, serving his plate. "Had worse," Silas replied, then actually smiled, a small, crooked thing that transformed his stern features. Though that rooster might think twice before visiting again. That evening, as Martha served pot roast with potatoes and gravy, Silas cleared his throat. "Noticed you've been reading my books." Martha's hands stilled. She had indeed been borrowing books from his small library, careful to return them exactly as found. "I apologize if I've overstepped." "No," he interrupted, then seemed surprised at his own vehemence. "I mean, it's fine. Good. Even books should be read." "You have interesting choices," Martha ventured. "Shakespeare, Emerson, but also farming almanacs and veterinary guides." "Man needs both poetry and practicality," Silas said, cutting his meat with precision. "My brother Samuel used to say that. He was the educated one. I just tried to keep up." It was the first time he'd mentioned his brother voluntarily. Martha sensed the weight of the admission and tread carefully. "He sounds wise." "He died at Antietam." Silas's jaw tightened. "Would have liked this place. Always talked about heading west, starting fresh." "So you did it for both of you?" Silas looked up sharply, But Martha's expression held no pity, only understanding. Maybe I did. After that evening, their meals became less silent. Silas would mention something from his day, a calf born healthy despite coming early, a section of fence that needed replacing before winter. Martha would share observations from her work, the best way to remove grass stains from denim, a recipe she wanted to try if he could get molasses in town. One evening, Silas came in later than usual, favoring his left hand. Martha looked up from her mending and immediately set it aside. What happened? Nothing. Just caught it between a post and a stubborn cow. Martha was already moving toward him, gently taking his massive hand in her smaller ones. The skin was scraped raw, blood already drying. This needs cleaning. Sit. He sat, watching her heat water, gather clean cloths and the carbolic acid she'd insisted he buy for emergencies. Her touch was gentle but efficient as she cleaned the wound. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "You've done this before," he observed. "My husband was a carpenter," she said quietly, wrapping his hand with careful precision. "Came home with cuts and scrapes regularly." "What happened to him?" The question came out before Silas could stop it. "Pneumonia. Last winter." Martha tied off the bandage. "He was strong as an ox one day, gone within a week." "I'm sorry." "So am I." She stepped back, surveying her work. "Keep that clean and dry. I'll change the bandage tomorrow." That night, Silas noticed Martha had left a book on his chair, one of her own, from the small collection she'd brought, Jane Eyre by Currer Bell. He opened it and found her neat handwriting on the first page. A story about finding home in unexpected places. M.E.E. He read late into the night, oil lamp burning low, discovering a story that felt both foreign and familiar. When Martha found him the next morning, he'd fallen asleep in his chair, the book open on his chest. She carefully marked his page and left him sleeping, a smile playing at her lips as she prepared a quiet breakfast. The sound of her humming woke him an hour later. He straightened, embarrassed, but Martha just poured his coffee without comment. "It's a good book," he said gruffly. "I thought you might appreciate it." Days developed a comfortable rhythm. Silas began coming in earlier, spending the last hour of daylight helping Martha with heavier tasks, carrying water, moving furniture for cleaning, splitting extra kindling. Martha started making his favorite foods more often, noting his preferences without making a fuss about it. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie with sudden violence. Silas was out checking the cattle when it hit. Martha stood at the window, watching the sky turn green-black, worry creasing her features. When he finally appeared through the driving rain, soaked through and muddy, she had towels ready and hot coffee waiting. "You were worried," he said, accepting the towel. "The lightning was fierce. A person could get struck out there." "Takes more than weather to stop me," he said, but his voice was gentle, touched by her concern. "Nevertheless," Martha said firmly, "next time you see a storm like that coming, you have sense enough to take shelter." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and Martha was startled to realize he was teasing her. That evening, with rain drumming on the roof and wind howling around the corners of the house, they sat in the parlor, Silas reading, Martha sewing new cushion covers for the chairs. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "This is nice," Silas said suddenly. Martha looked up from her sewing. "What is—" He gestured vaguely at the room, the fire, the two of them existing comfortably in the same space. "This having company." "It is," Martha agreed softly. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to not eat supper alone." They looked at each other across the room, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. Two people who had resigned themselves to solitude, discovering that loneliness shared was somehow more bearable than loneliness endured alone. "Martha," Silas said, then stopped, color rising in his cheeks. "That is Mrs. Ellis." "Martha is fine," she said, We're past formalities. I think. Martha, he repeated, testing the name. Would you like me to teach you to ride? Might be useful. Living out here. Martha's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. I'd like that very much. The next morning, despite threatening clouds, Silas brought around a gentle mare named Buttercup. Martha had changed into a split skirt she'd modified from one of her dresses. Practical but proper. Silas helped her mount, his large hands steady at her waist, lifting her as easily as he might lift a child. Hold the reins like this, he instructed, adjusting her grip. She'll respond to the smallest pressure. Don't need force, just intention. Martha proved a quick student, and within an hour she was riding circles around the yard while Silas watched from the fence, calling out occasional corrections. When she laughed, really laughed, at the sheer joy of movement and freedom. Something in Silas's chest tightened and released, like a fist unclenching after years of holding on too tight. That evening, as Martha served dinner, she was still glowing from the afternoon's adventure. Thank you, she said, setting down his plate. I haven't felt that free in a very long time. You did well, Silas said. Natural rider. We'll go again tomorrow if you'd like. I'd like that very much. As they ate, conversation flowing easier than ever before, neither acknowledged what was becoming increasingly clear, that this arrangement had become something more than employer and employee. Something more than two lonely souls sharing space. It had become friendship, perhaps even the foundation of something deeper, built on shared meals and quiet evenings, on small kindnesses and gentle understanding, on the slow, careful revelation that maybe, just maybe, neither of them had to be alone anymore. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with life. Martha's soft singing in the kitchen. Silas's deep voice reading aloud in the evenings when Martha asked him to. The comfortable sounds of two people learning to exist in harmony. The giant cowboy and the lonely widow, finding in each other not what they had looked for, but perhaps what they had needed all along. The whispers started during Martha's 5th week at the Double M Ranch, like prairie fire. They spread from the church steps to the general store, from the boarding house parlor to the saloon's back rooms. Silas McGraw, that giant hermit who'd barely spoken 10 words to anyone in years, had taken in a young widow, living under the same roof, just the two of them, 15 miles from proper civilization. Martha first encountered the full force of the town's judgment on a crisp Sunday morning. She'd ridden Buttercup to church, having finally felt steady enough to make the journey alone. Silas had offered to accompany her, but she'd seen the discomfort in his eyes at the prospect and assured him she'd be fine. She wasn't fine. The moment she tied Buttercup to the hitching post, she felt the eyes. Women who'd nodded politely at her during her shopping trips now stood in clusters, heads bent together, glances sharp as hawk talons. Martha held her head high, walked into the small wooden church, and took a seat in an empty pew near the back. The whispers followed her like rustling leaves. Living alone with that man. No chaperone, not even a neighbor for miles. What kind of widow conducts herself so? Reverend Thompson, a thin man with kind eyes, delivered his sermon on charity and judgment, but his words fell on deliberately deaf ears. After the service, as Martha tried to make her way to the door, she found her path blocked by 3 women she recognized as the town's self-appointed moral guardians. Mrs. Prudence Henderson from the general store, Mrs. Catherine Blackwood, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, who ran the boarding house. Mrs. Ellis. Mrs. Henderson began, her tone sweet as spoiled molasses. We've been meaning to speak with you. Ladies, Martha acknowledged, trying to step around them. Mrs. Blackwood moved to block her. We're concerned about your situation. My employment. You mean your reputation. Mrs. Walsh corrected, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper. Dear, you must know how it looks. A young woman like yourself, alone with that strange man. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. McGraw has been nothing but proper and respectful. Oh, I'm sure he has, Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing look that suggested the opposite. But men have needs, dear, and a woman in your vulnerable position. My position, Martha said carefully, is that of a housekeeper. I cook, I clean, I maintain the household, nothing more. But surely you must see how inappropriate it is. Mrs. Blackwood pressed. An unmarried man and a widow, unchaperoned. I see that I need work to survive, Martha interrupted, her voice gaining steel. I see that Mr. McGraw needs someone to manage his household. It's a business arrangement, nothing more or less. Mrs. Walsh placed a hand on Martha's arm with false sympathy. We're only thinking of your welfare. Dear, perhaps if you stayed at the boarding house in town, traveled out daily. 15 miles each way in winter coming. Martha pulled her arm free. That's impractical and you know it. Then perhaps, Mrs. Henderson suggested with a sly smile, you should seek employment elsewhere. The saloon is always looking for serving girls. The insult was clear. Martha's hands clenched in her gloves. But before she could respond, a deep voice rumbled from behind the women. Is there a problem here? Silas stood in the church doorway, his massive frame blocking the sunlight. He'd come after all, dressed in his cleanest clothes, hat in hand. The three women stepped back instinctively. Mr. McGraw, Mrs. Henderson recovered first. We were just offering Mrs. Ellis some guidance. Sounded more like harassment to me, Silas said mildly, but his gray eyes were storm dark. Martha, you ready to go? Martha, not Mrs. Ellis. The use of her Christian name sent the gossips into a tizzy of meaningful looks. Yes, Martha said, moving past the women to stand beside Silas. Thank you for coming. They walked to the horses together, Silas's presence creating a path through the gathered crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. He helped her mount Buttercup, his hands steady and impersonal at her waist, then swung onto his own horse, a massive black stallion named Thunder. They rode in silence until the town disappeared behind them. Then Silas spoke. I'm sorry about that. It's not your fault. It is. I should have considered how this would look. My reputation doesn't matter, hasn't for years. But yours. Martha turned Buttercup to face him. Mr. McGraw, Silas, I knew there would be talk when I took this position. I decided my survival was more important than their good opinion. Still, if you want to leave, find something else. Do you want me to leave? The question hung between them. Silas looked at her. This small, fierce woman who'd brought warmth back to his cold house, who hummed while she cooked, who treated him like a person instead of an oddity. No, he said roughly. No, I don't want you to leave. Then I won't. Let them talk. But the talk grew worse. The next Saturday, when they went to town for supplies, Henderson served them with barely concealed contempt. Other customers left the store rather than share space with them. Someone had painted Jezebel on the side of Silas's wagon while they shopped, though he quickly covered it with his coat before Martha could see. The final straw came the following Sunday. Martha had decided to skip church, but 3 wagons appeared at the ranch just after noon. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Blackwood, and Mrs. Walsh had brought reinforcements, their husbands and several other upstanding citizens, including Mayor Garrett himself. Silas met them in the yard, Martha standing in the doorway behind him. McGraw, the mayor began pompously. We're here on a matter of community concern. My property, my concern, Silas replied. The moral fabric of our town, Mrs. Henderson started. Stops at my gate, Silas interrupted. You're trespassing. Mr. Blackwood, the banker, stepped forward. Now see here, McGraw. We're trying to help. This arrangement is scandalous. If you need a housekeeper, hire someone appropriate. Old Widow Muller in town. Can barely walk, let alone manage a ranch house, Martha said, stepping beside Silas. Which you'd know if Christian charity meant more to you than gossip. Mrs. Walsh gasped. How dare you speak to us about Christian charity? How dare you come to our home and make vile insinuations? Martha shot back. You claim to be concerned about propriety. Where's the propriety in harassment, in painting ugly words on wagons, in spreading lies? Lies, Mrs. Henderson's face turned red. We've seen how he looks at you. The words hung in the air. Silas went very still, and Martha felt something shift in her chest. And how? Martha said quietly, dangerously. Does he look at me? Like a man looks at a woman he's familiar with. Martha laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. You mean with respect, with kindness, yes. I suppose that would seem foreign to you. Mrs. Henderson, married to a man who spends more time at the saloon than at home. Henderson stepped forward angrily, but Silas moved slightly, just enough to remind everyone of his size. Get off my land, Silas said, his voice low and final. All of you, don't come back. Martha and I will continue our business arrangement as we see fit. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, I suggest you find something else to occupy your minds. This isn't over, Mayor Garrett warned. This kind of impropriety. What impropriety? Martha demanded. Name one improper thing you've witnessed. One actual transgression beyond your filthy imaginations. Silence. That's what I thought? Martha lifted her chin. You're not concerned about morality. You're jealous. Jealous that I have employment. That I'm surviving without your approval. That Mr. McGraw treats me with more genuine respect than you've shown anyone you consider beneath you. We're trying to save you from yourself. Mrs. Blackwood insisted. I don't need saving, Martha replied. Especially not from the only person in this territory who's shown me true Christian kindness. Now get off our property before Mr. McGraw loses his patience. Trust me, you don't want to see that. Silas stood silent, solid as a mountain, until the wagons rolled away. Then his shoulders sagged slightly. Our property, he said quietly. Martha colored. I know what you meant. He turned to look at her. They won't stop. It'll get worse now. I don't care. You should. Your reputation. My reputation was ruined the day I became a widow without money, Martha said bluntly. At least here. I have work. I have purpose. She stopped, looked away. What? Silas asked softly. What do you have? Martha met his eyes. A friend. At least, I hope I do. Something passed over Silas's face, an expression Martha couldn't quite read. Yes, he said roughly. Yes, you do. That evening, as they ate dinner in comfortable defiance of the town's judgment, Silas cleared his throat. They weren't entirely wrong. Martha looked up from her plate. About how I look at you, he clarified, then immediately focused on his food. I try not to, but sometimes you're humming in the kitchen, or the sun catches your hair, or you smile at something in one of those books, and I look. Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't mind. Silas's head came up sharply. When you look at me, Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't mind. They stared at each other across the table, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Then Martha stood, began clearing dishes with hands that trembled slightly. Silas rose to help, and for a moment their hands touched over a plate. Neither pulled away immediately. The town could whisper all it wanted, here, in this house that was becoming a home. Something deeper than scandal was taking root, something that had nothing to do with impropriety and everything to do with two wounded hearts learning, perhaps, to beat again. The discovery came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning when the roof in the storage room finally gave way to years of weathering. Silas had been meaning to repair it, but with Martha's arrival and the subsequent drama with the townspeople, it had slipped his mind. Now, water poured through, soaking everything stored beneath. "We need to move all this quickly," Martha said, already grabbing boxes. They worked together, hauling crates and trunks to dry ground. One particular trunk, older than the rest and bearing the initials J.M., Silas's father, Josiah McGraw, split open when Silas lifted it, spilling its contents across the wet floor. "Leave it," Silas said roughly, seeing the old papers. "Just trash from my father's time." But Martha had already knelt, gathering the documents before the water could destroy them completely. Her hand stilled on a particular paper, eyes widening as she read. "Silas, this is a mineral rights claim." He paused, then came to look over her shoulder. The document was dated 1851, signed by his father and properly witnessed. It granted mineral and mining rights to a significant portion of land, not just the ranch, but extending into the hills beyond. "Father never mentioned mining," Silas said, taking the paper carefully. "He was a cattleman through and through." Martha found more papers, geological surveys suggesting copper deposits, possibly silver, letters from mining companies expressing interest, all dated before Josiah McGraw's death 8 years prior. "He never developed it?" Martha asked. "Never even told me about it. We had the cattle. That was enough." Silas studied the papers with growing unease. Father wasn't one for keeping secrets. Unless he had a reason, Martha finished. That afternoon, while Martha prepared dinner, Silas rode to the eastern boundary of his property, to the hills mentioned in the surveys. He'd never paid them much attention, rocky, unsuitable for grazing, covered in scrub pine. But now, looking with different eyes, he saw the signs quartz outcroppings that suggested mineralization, old trail marks that might have been from his father's explorations, and most tellingly, fresh horse tracks that weren't his own. Someone else knew about the mineral rights. Someone had been surveying his land. The answer came 3 days later in the form of Bartholomew Crane himself. Arriving in a black carriage more suited to city streets than ranch roads, Crane was everything Silas wasn't. Smooth, polished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most cowboys made in a year. 2 men flanked him, hard-eyed individuals who kept their hands near their coat pockets in a way that suggested concealed weapons. Martha watched from the kitchen window as Silas met them in the yard. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read body language. Crane was all expansive gestures and apparent friendliness. Silas stood like a granite monument, arms crossed, unmoved. After 20 minutes, Crane and his men left. Silas came inside, his face dark as a thundercloud. "What did he want?" Martha asked, though she suspected she knew. "To buy the ranch, offered 3 times what it's worth for cattle land." "Because of the minerals?" Silas nodded grimly. He knew about the surveys. Claimed my father had made a verbal agreement to sell the rights to Crane's company before he died. No proof, of course, but Crane suggested proof could be arranged. Martha felt a chill. "He threatened you?" "Not directly. Men like Crane never do anything directly. He mentioned how accidents happen on ranches, cattle disappear, fires start. Made a point of asking if I had any family to inherit if something happened to me. We should go to the sheriff. Sheriff's in Crane's pocket. Half the town council, too. His money owns more than buildings in Dry Creek." Martha poured coffee with hands that wanted to tremble. "What will you do?" "Nothing. I'm not selling." "Silas, if he's dangerous." "I've faced dangerous before." He met her eyes. "But I should tell you, Martha, this could get unpleasant. Crane doesn't like being told no. It might be safer if you..." "If you finish that sentence by suggesting I leave, I'll hit you with this coffee pot." Martha interrupted. "We've had this discussion. I'm not going anywhere." Something softened in Silas's expression. All right, but we need to be careful. Both of us. The pressure started subtly. First, Henderson's general store suddenly couldn't fill Silas's orders. Supply problems, Henderson claimed, though his shelves seemed well stocked for other customers. Then the bank sent a notice about reviewing the small loan Silas had taken for winter feed, suggesting immediate repayment might be necessary. One morning, Martha found 3 of their chickens dead, necks wrung. No predator did that. Silas found fence lines cut on the eastern boundary, cattle wandering onto land that happened to belong to one of Crane's associates, who immediately filed a complaint about trespassing livestock. "He's trying to pressure you into selling," Martha said over dinner, her voice tight with anger. "He's trying to break me," Silas corrected. "Make things so difficult, I'll take his offer just for peace." "Will you?" Silas looked at her steadily. "My father held this land. My brother died believing I'd make something of it. I'm not selling to a carpetbagger who thinks money entitles him to everything." 2 nights later, Martha woke to the smell of smoke. She ran from her room to find Silas already rushing outside. The barn was ablaze, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky. Together they fought the fire, hauling water, leading terrified horses to safety. By dawn, they'd saved most of the structure, though the damage was significant. Sheriff Dixon arrived late morning, looked around perfunctorily, and declared it an accident. "Lamp must have fallen," he suggested, though they all knew Silas never left lamps burning in the barn. After the sheriff left, Crane himself appeared, surveying the damage with theatrical concern. "Terrible accident," he said smoothly. "These old wooden structures, so vulnerable. Of course, if you're finding ranch management too challenging, my offer stands. In fact, given recent events, I might even increase it. Enough for you to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere safer." "The only danger to my ranch," Silas said quietly, "is standing in front of me." Crane's friendly mask slipped for a moment. "That's a serious accusation. McGraw, a man could find himself in legal trouble, making unfounded claims, or worse trouble, if he's not careful." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice from someone who wants to help." Crane's smile was cold. "Mrs. Ellis, surely you can see reason. A woman of your circumstances must understand the value of financial security." Martha stepped beside Silas. "I understand the value of integrity. Mr. Crane, something you seem to have sold along with your soul." Crane's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, both of you." "The only mistake," Silas said, "would be letting you set foot on my property again. Get out! Don't come back!" As Crane's carriage rolled away, Martha noticed Silas's hands were clenched into fists. She touched his arm gently. "He won't stop," Silas said. "No," Martha agreed. "He won't, but neither will we." That evening, as they worked together to shore up the damaged barn, Martha asked, "Why didn't your father develop the mining rights?" Silas hammered a board into place before answering. "Found something in his papers. A letter he started but never sent. He'd seen what mining did to other places. The land torn up, water poisoned, boom towns that became ghost towns. He wanted to leave something lasting, something clean. Cattle might not make a man rich, but they don't destroy the land for generations to come." Martha understood then. This wasn't just about property or money. It was about legacy, about honoring the dead, about preserving something worth more than whatever metals lay beneath the rocky hills. "Your father was a wise man," she said. "He was, and he'd have liked you." Silas paused in his work. "You didn't have to stand with me against Crane. This isn't your fight." Martha met his eyes in the fading light. "Isn't it? This is my home too now. Silas, maybe not legally, but—" She trailed off, then strengthened her voice. "You're not facing this alone." Silas studied her for a long moment. This remarkable woman who'd somehow become essential to his life in such a short time. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried weight. As they returned to the house, Neither noticed the figure watching from the hillside, taking notes. Crane had made his threats clear, but he'd also revealed something important. He believed Martha was Silas's weakness, a pressure point to exploit. He was wrong. She wasn't his weakness. Standing together in the gathering dusk, unified in purpose and growing closer in affection they hadn't yet named, Martha Ellis was becoming Silas McGraw's greatest strength. The first frost came early that year, silvering the grass and turning breath to mist in the morning air. Martha stood at the kitchen window, watching Silas repair the fence that had been mysteriously damaged again during the night. His movements were steady, methodical, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weariness that came from fighting a battle on multiple fronts. She'd been at the Double M for 2 months now, and somewhere between the shared meals and the shared struggles, something had fundamentally shifted. The sight of him no longer just meant safety and employment. It meant something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster when he smiled, something that kept her awake at night wondering what it would feel like to smooth the worry lines from his forehead. "You're wool gathering again," she murmured to herself, turning from the window to tend the bread she was baking. But her hands stilled on the dough as she heard the sound of approaching horses, not the single rider that might mean trouble, but several, moving fast. Silas heard them too. He was already walking toward the house when 4 riders appeared, but these weren't Crane's men. They were neighboring ranchers, Tom Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and the Hendricks brothers, all small holders who'd been struggling against the same mysterious troubles plaguing the Double M. "McGraw," Morrison called out, dismounting. "We need to talk." Martha brought coffee to the porch where the men gathered, and Silas didn't send her away. She'd earned her place in these discussions through the fire and the threats, through standing firm when others would have fled. "Crane's been to see all of us," Sullivan said without preamble, "offering to buy our lands for twice their worth. Those who said no have had troubles." One of the Hendricks brothers added, "Lost cattle, damaged equipment, wells gone bad." "And those who said yes?" Silas asked. Morrison's face darkened. "Signed over their deeds and got half what was promised. Crane had papers saying they owed debts to his bank, debts they'd never taken on, but the signatures looked real enough for the law. He's trying to control the whole valley," Sullivan said, "and we know why now. Railroads coming through next year, right through land Crane's been grabbing up." Martha felt Silas go still beside her. A railroad meant the land values would triple, maybe more. It also meant Crane stood to make a fortune if he could control the right-of-way. "We're thinking it's time to stand together," Morrison continued. "Pool our resources, hire a real lawyer from Denver, maybe get federal marshals involved. Crane owns the local law," Silas pointed out, "but not federal law, and not the newspapers in Denver and San Francisco. We make enough noise, someone will listen." They talked for another hour, planning, strategizing. When the ranchers left, they'd formed an alliance, agreeing to meet again in 3 days to formalize their resistance. Martha stood with Silas, watching them ride away. "It's dangerous," he said quietly. "Crane won't like being challenged openly." "He's already dangerous," Martha replied. "At least now you're not alone." Silas turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I haven't been alone since you arrived." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Silas cleared his throat, stepped back. "I should check the stock." But that evening, as Martha served supper, he caught her hand as she set down his plate. "Martha, I need to say something." She stood perfectly still, aware of his calloused fingers gentle on her wrist. "If something happens to me, nothing will happen. Listen, please, I've written a will. It's with a lawyer in Cheyenne, not local. If something happens, the ranch goes to you." Martha pulled her hand away, shocked. "Silas, no, I can't." You've worked this place beside me. You know it. know the people, the land, and—" He paused, struggling for words. "I want to know it'll be cared for by someone who understands what it means." "What does it mean?" she asked softly. He stood, moving to the window, looking out at the land bathed in twilight. "It means home. It means building something that lasts. It means—" He turned back to her. "It means having someone to build it for." Martha's heart was thundering so loud she was sure he could hear it. She crossed to him, stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. "You're not going to die," she said firmly. "Because I won't let you. We're going to fight Crane, and we're going to win, and we're going to build something lasting. Together." "Together," he repeated, the word rough with emotion. She reached up, her hand seeming small against his chest. "Silas." He covered her hand with his, held it against his heart. I know we said this was business. But Martha, I know," she whispered. "Me too." He bent his head. She raised hers, and their lips met in a kiss that was tender and desperate all at once. Two lonely souls finally admitting what had been growing between them for weeks. When they parted, Martha's cheeks were flushed, Silas's eyes bright with wonder. "I didn't plan this," he said. "Neither did I, but here we are." "Here we are." He agreed, then kissed her again. Softer this time, like they had all the time in the world. But time was exactly what they didn't have. The next morning brought news that Tom Morrison's barn had burned to the ground. The morning after that, Jake Sullivan's well was poisoned with lye. The alliance was being tested before it could solidify. Silas rode out to help Morrison, leaving Martha with his rifle and strict instructions to bar the door. She agreed, but the moment he was gone, she saddled Buttercup and rode to town. If Crane wanted to play with fire, she'd give him something to burn. She found him at the Imperial Hotel, holding court in the dining room with his associates. Martha walked in, head high, ignoring the shocked whispers of the other patrons. Mr. Crane," she said clearly. "A word." He looked up, amused. "Mrs. Ellis, how delightful. Have you come to your senses about my offer?" "I've come to deliver a message. We've contacted the Denver Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Territorial Governor's Office. We've documented every suspicious incident, every threat, every burned barn and poisoned well. If one more thing happens to any rancher in this valley, those documents go public." Crane's amusement faded. "You're bluffing." Martha pulled out a telegram receipt. "Wire sent yesterday. Response expected within the week. You're not the only one with connections. Mr. Crane." It was partially a bluff. She'd sent inquiries, not full documentation, but Crane didn't know that. His eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're meddling in affairs beyond your understanding, woman." "I understand perfectly. You're a thief and a bully who's forgotten that some people can't be bought or broken." She leaned forward slightly. "Silas McGraw's one of those people. So am I." She turned to leave, but Crane's voice stopped her. "You love him." It wasn't a question. Martha turned back, met his gaze steadily. "Yes. Love makes people vulnerable. Mrs. Ellis makes them weak." "No, Mr. Crane. Love makes people fight harder than you can possibly imagine." When she returned to the ranch, Silas was already there, pacing the porch like a caged bear. "Where were you? I told you to stay." "I went to see Crane." His face went pale, then red. "You did what?" She told him everything. By the end, he was sitting on the porch steps, head in his hands. "You took a terrible risk. No more than you take every day." She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We're in this together. Remember?" He turned to look at her, and his expression was so full of emotions, fear, anger, admiration, and yes, love, that it took her breath away. "Martha Ellis," he said slowly, "you are the bravest, most foolish, Most wonderful woman I've ever known. Is that a compliment? It's a fact. He pulled her close, pressed his lips to her forehead. Don't do that again. My heart can't take it. Your heart seems pretty strong to me, she murmured against his chest. It is now, he admitted, now that it's not empty anymore. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they sat together on the porch of the house that had become a home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats from Crane, new battles to fight. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The confrontation came on a cold November morning, 3 days after Martha's bold visit to Crane. Silas had just returned from checking the cattle when he saw the dust cloud approaching. Too many riders for comfort, moving with purpose toward the Double M. Martha, get inside, he called, already reaching for the Winchester propped by the door. But Martha emerged instead, the shotgun in her hands. I told you, we face this together. There was no time to argue. Bartholomew Crane rode at the head of a dozen men, including Sheriff Dixon and several deputies whose badges seemed more like decorations than symbols of law. They stopped just outside the yard, spreading out in a semicircle that blocked any escape route. McGraw, Crane called out, remaining mounted. I've come with a legal writ. Nothing you do is legal. Crane. Sheriff Dixon rode forward, pulling a document from his coat. This is a notice of foreclosure on your property for failure to repay outstanding debts to the Dry Creek Bank. I don't owe the bank anything, Silas said flatly. According to these papers, you do. $3,000, taken as loan 6 months ago. Payment is due immediately. Martha stepped forward. That's impossible. I've kept the books for 2 months. There's no such loan. Crane smiled coldly. Your signature says otherwise. McGraw, sheriff's here to enforce the foreclosure. You can leave peacefully or what? Silas's voice was dangerously quiet. Or we'll remove you by force. The sound of approaching horses made everyone turn. Tom Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and 8 other ranchers appeared over the ridge, all armed. Spreading out to flank Crane's men, the odds had just shifted. Seems like you've got company. McGraw, Morrison called out, his rifle resting across his saddle. Crane's jaw tightened. This is legal business. Morrison, interfere and you'll be arrested. By whose authority? A new voice rang out, and everyone turned to see a man in a federal marshal's badge riding up with 2 deputies. Marshal James Hartley, whom Martha had wired from town, had arrived from Cheyenne just in time. Federal authority supersedes local law in matters of fraud, Hartley announced. Dismounting. Mr. Crane, I'll need to see those loan documents. This is local business, Sheriff Dixon started. Not anymore. Hartley examined the papers, then looked at Silas. Mr. McGraw, is this your signature? Never seen those papers before in my life. Hartley nodded. I'll need to compare this with verified documents. In the meantime, this foreclosure is suspended pending federal investigation. Crane's face darkened. You can't. I can and I am. Furthermore, I've received multiple complaints about intimidation, arson, and assault connected to land grabbing in this valley. Mr. Crane, you and your associates will need to answer some questions. This is ridiculous. I'm a legitimate businessman. Martha spoke up clearly. A legitimate businessman doesn't burn barns or poison wells. A legitimate businessman doesn't forge documents or threaten widows. Careful, Mrs. Ellis, Crane warned. Slander is a serious charge. As is conspiracy to defraud, Marshal Hartley interjected. Mr. Crane, I suggest you and your men withdraw. Any further harassment of these ranchers will result in federal charges. For a moment, the tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Crane's men looked to him, hands near their weapons. The ranchers held steady, waiting. Then Crane smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't over. McGraw, federal marshals can't stay forever." "They don't need to," Silas replied. "We're not going anywhere." Crane wheeled his horse around, his men following. Sheriff Dixon hesitated, then rode after them, his allegiance clear. As they disappeared down the road, a collective breath was released. Marshal Hartley turned to Silas. "You understand he's right. I can't stay permanently. And while I'll file my report, building a federal case takes time." "We know," Morrison said. "But time is what we needed. Thank you, Marshal." Hartley nodded. "I'll be in town for a week, investigating. Any problems, you send word immediately." As the marshal and his deputies left, the neighboring ranchers gathered closer. Sullivan spoke first. "He'll be back. Men like Crane don't give up easy." "Let him come," Silas said. "We'll be ready." "All of us," Morrison added, looking around at his fellow ranchers. "We stand together or we fall separately." They spent the next hour planning establishing watch rotations, setting up signal fires, organizing their defense. When the ranchers finally departed, each man shook Silas's hand, nodded respectfully to Martha. She'd proven herself as surely as any of them. As the last rider disappeared, Martha felt the trembling she'd been suppressing finally take hold. Silas noticed immediately, wrapping his arms around her. "You were magnificent," he murmured into her hair. "I was terrified." "So was I, but we stood anyway. That's what courage is." They went inside, and Martha made coffee with shaking hands, while Silas secured the windows and checked the rifles. As night fell, they sat together by the fire, the weight of the day settling over them. "He won't stop," Martha said quietly. "Crane's too proud, too greedy." "I know." Silas stared into the flames. "Maybe I should have sold, kept you out of danger." Martha turned to face him fully. "Silas McGraw, don't you dare! This land is your father's legacy, your brother's dream, and now it's ours to protect." "Ours," he repeated softly, then pulled her close. "Martha, when this is over." A shot rang out, shattering the window. They dove for cover as more shots followed, peppering the house. Silas crawled to the window, peering out carefully. 6 men, maybe 7. They're trying to pin us down." Martha grabbed the shotgun. "The signal fire." "Too dangerous. They'd cut us down before we reached it." More shots, then shouting. Someone was trying to get to the barn, likely to set it ablaze again. Silas fired back, his shots careful and measured. Martha watched the back door, ready for anyone trying to flank them. Then, through the chaos, came the sound of a horn. Morrison's signal. The neighboring ranchers had been watching, waiting. Within minutes, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. "Crane's men are running," Martha called out, seeing figures fleeing in the darkness. The rescue party pursued briefly but pulled back rather than ride into a potential ambush. Morrison and Sullivan stayed at the Double M that night, taking turns on watch. "This was desperate," Morrison observed. "Attacking directly like that. Crane's getting reckless. Or running out of time." Sullivan suggested, "Maybe our federal friend has him more worried than he let on." The next morning brought unexpected news. The Denver Post had published Martha's story, a detailed account of Crane's attempted land grab, complete with names, dates, and incidents. She'd written it in secret, sent it with her telegram to the marshal. The headline read, "Terror in the Territory, How One Man's Greed Threatens Honest Ranchers." Silas read it twice, then looked at Martha with amazement. "When did you—" "The night after the barn fire. I couldn't sleep, so I wrote. I thought maybe if people knew." "The whole territory will know now," Morrison said admiringly. "Crane's name will be mud." Indeed, by afternoon, word came that several of Crane's investors had withdrawn their support. The railroad company announced they were reconsidering their route, Unwilling to be associated with controversy, Crane's empire, built on intimidation and fraud, was crumbling. But cornered animals are the most dangerous. That evening, as Martha and Silas sat down to dinner, Morrison and Sullivan having returned to their own spreads, they heard a single horse approaching. Silas grabbed his rifle, but the rider called out in a familiar voice. "McGraw, it's Sheriff Dixon. I'm alone and unarmed." They met him on the porch. The sheriff looked haggard, older somehow. "Crane's gone mad," he said without preamble. "He's planning something for tomorrow. Blames you for everything. I can't be part of it anymore." "Why warn us?" Silas asked suspiciously. Dixon looked at Martha. "My daughter. She's about your age. When I thought about someone doing to her what Crane planned." He shuddered. "I've done enough wrong. Maybe this makes it a little right." "What's he planning?" Martha asked. "He's got dynamite. Plans to blow the dam upstream, flood your valley, make it look like an accident. He figures if he can't have the land, he'll make sure no one can use it." Silas and Martha exchanged horrified looks. A flood would destroy not just the Double M, but every ranch downstream. "When?" Silas demanded. "Dawn, maybe earlier. We need to warn everyone. Stop him." "I'll ride to town, alert the marshal." Dixon said, "You warn the ranchers. Maybe we can stop this." As Dixon rode off, Silas turned to Martha. "You need to get to safety. Ride to town now." "No." Her voice was steel. "We end this together." He saw the determination in her eyes and knew arguing was useless. "Then we ride. We've got lives to save." They saddled up quickly, racing through the darkness to spread the warning. The confrontation with Bartholomew Crane was coming to a head, and this time, it would be final. One way or another, by tomorrow's dawn, the battle for the valley would be over. The dawn came slowly to the valley, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose. Bartholomew Crane stood at the edge of the damaged dam, watching his remaining men flee as Marshal Hartley's deputies surrounded them. His dynamite plot had failed. The ranchers had arrived in time, and the federal lawmen had caught him literally red-handed with explosives. "It's over. Crane!" Marshal Hartley called out. "Come quietly and it'll go easier for you." Crane laughed bitterly, his once immaculate suit now torn and muddy from the confrontation. "Easier, I'm ruined either way." As the deputies led him away in chains, he passed Silas and Martha, standing together with the other ranchers. "You won," he spat. "But what have you really won, a piece of dirt and rocks?" "A home," Martha replied quietly. "Something you'll never understand." With Crane's arrest, the immediate danger passed. The federal investigation revealed the extent of his crimes-forged documents. Bribery, conspiracy, attempted murder. He would spend many years in federal prison. Sheriff Dixon, having turned state's evidence, lost his badge but avoided jail. The town council, freed from Crane's influence, elected Tom Morrison as the new sheriff. 3 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, the Double M Ranch looked transformed, not just because the barn was fully repaired or because the fences stood straight and true, but because of the wagons and horses filling the yard, the neighbors who'd come to witness something special. Silas stood near the porch in his best clothes, a proper suit Martha had insisted he order from Denver. His massive frame looked uncomfortable in the formal wear, but his face glowed with an emotion that needed no adornment joy. Martha emerged from the house in a simple but elegant dress of soft blue wool, her auburn hair pinned up with small white flowers woven through it. She'd removed her mourning black a week prior, packing it away with a photograph of James and a quiet prayer of thanks for the love they'd shared and acceptance of the love she'd found. Reverend Thompson stood ready to perform the ceremony, having made the journey from town specifically for this occasion. As Martha walked toward Silas, the assembled crowd of ranchers and their families fell silent. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, "we gather here today to witness the union of Silas McGraw and Martha Ellis, two souls who found each other across loss and loneliness, who stood together against adversity, and who now choose to build a future as one. Silas took Martha's hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit despite the size difference. His voice was steady as he spoke his vows. "Martha, you came to my door looking for work and shelter, but you gave me so much more. You brought light to my darkness, warmth to my cold house, and love to my empty heart. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and cherish you all the days of my life. You transformed this house into a home, and I promise to spend every day making sure you never regret choosing to stay." Martha's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she responded. "Silas, you offered me sanctuary when I had nowhere to go, respect when the world showed me none, and love when I thought my heart would never heal. You stood as my shield against those who would harm us, and as my partner in building something beautiful from sorrow. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to fill our home with laughter and love, and to never let you feel alone again." "The rings?" Reverend Thompson asked. Jake Sullivan stepped forward with 2 simple gold bands. Silas had crafted them himself from gold nuggets found on his land. Not enough to mine, but enough for this purpose. As they exchanged rings, Morrison's wife began to cry softly, and even some of the toughest ranchers had to clear their throats suspiciously. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming," Reverend Thompson declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Silas, you may kiss your bride." Silas bent down. Martha reached up, and their kiss was met with cheers and applause that echoed across the valley. When they parted, both were smiling broader than anyone had ever seen. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Tables made from sawhorses and planks groaned under the weight of food brought by neighbors. Mrs. Morrison had baked a 3-tier cake. The Hendricks brothers had brought their fiddles, and soon music filled the air. As the sun began to set, Silas and Martha stood on the porch, watching their friends and neighbors dance in their yard. The house behind them glowed with lamplight through the yellow calico curtains, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. "No regrets?" Silas asked softly, his arm around Martha's waist. "Only one," she replied. He looked down at her, concerned. "What?" "That it took so long to find you." He pulled her closer. "We found each other when we needed to. That's what matters." Tom Morrison climbed onto a crate, raising his glass. "A toast to Silas and Martha McGraw, who showed us all that standing together makes us stronger than standing alone. May their home be blessed with love, laughter, and prosperity." "Hear, hear," the crowd responded, raising their own glasses. As the evening progressed, the story of their courtship was already becoming legend. The giant cowboy who'd lived alone for so long, the brave widow who'd stood up to the town gossips and land grabbers alike. The love that had grown from simple meals and quiet evenings into something strong enough to defeat greed and corruption. Later, when the guests had gone and the ranch was quiet again, Silas and Martha sat together on their porch, wrapped in a quilt against the December chill. The stars above were brilliant in the clear winter sky. "What are you thinking?" Martha asked, feeling Silas's thoughtful silence. "About Samuel, about my father, wondering if they'd approve of what we've built here." Martha took his large hand in both of hers. "They'd be proud. You've honored their memory by creating something lasting, something good." "We've created it," he corrected. "Together." She smiled, leaning into his warmth. "I was thinking we should plant a garden come spring. Vegetables, but flowers too. Roses by the porch. Maybe." "Anything you want." "And maybe—" She paused, suddenly shy. "Maybe we could add another room or two to the house. For the future." Silas's heart skipped. "For children." "Would you want that?" He turned to face her fully. "Martha, I want everything with you. Children to fill this house with noise and chaos. Grandchildren someday to spoil. A life so full of love that the loneliness we both knew becomes just a distant memory." "Then that's what we'll build," she said, sealing the promise with a kiss. As they went inside their home, truly their home now, the ranch stood peaceful under the starlight. The cattle were safe in the pastures, the horses secure in the repaired barn. The land that Crane had tried to steal stretched out in all directions, protected and cherished. In the kitchen where Martha had cooked that first meal, where they'd shared so many conversations over coffee, where their love had grown from cautious friendship to deep devotion. Silas added wood to the stove while Martha put the kettle on for tea. "I love you, Mrs. McGraw," he said, still marveling at the words. "And I love you, Mr. McGraw," she replied, moving into his arms. Outside, a gentle snow began to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. It covered the scars of recent battles, the tracks of departed enemies, leaving only peace and the promise of new beginnings. The giant cowboy who'd hired a lonely widow to cook for him had found more than he'd ever dared to hope for. And the widow who'd arrived with nothing but determination and $17 to her name had discovered that sometimes, when you feed a starving heart, it learns to love again. In the warmth of their kitchen, with snow falling softly outside and their whole future stretching before them, Silas and Martha McGraw began their married life together. The house was warm, the larder was full, and most importantly, neither of them would ever be alone again. Spring would bring the garden Martha dreamed of. Summer would see their first harvest as husband and wife, and by the following winter, the sound of a baby's cry would echo through the house, bringing a joy neither had imagined possible in their darkest days. But tonight, they had each other, and that was everything. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier romances. And share your thoughts about Silas and Martha's journey in the comments.